Georg Hegel's Philosophy of Mind, recorded on Luxottica Ray-Ban Stories by Facebook, which is now Meta. Today, two Hegels flew into the upper atmosphere with Blue Horizon, a company owned by Jeff Bezos, former CEO and the founder of Amazon.com. Section 1, Subjective Mind. Subsection C, Psychology, Mind, Der Geist. Subsection A, Theoretical Mind. Theo is God, and retinical is lens, so theoretical is the lens of God. Metasection Gamma, Thinking, Das Denken. Encyclopedia section 465. Intelligence is recognitive. It cognizes an intuition, but only because that intuition is already its own. See Encyclopedia section 454. And in the name, it rediscovers the fact, section 462, but now it finds its universal in the double signification of the universal as such, and of the universal as immediate or as being. Finds, in essence, the genuine universal, which is its own unity, overlapping and including its other, vis-a-vis, being. Thus, intelligence is explicitly and on its own part cognitive. Virtually, it is the universal. Its product, the thought, is the thing. It is a plain identity of subjective and objective. It knows that what is thought is, and that what is only is, insofar as it is a thought. See soon, section 521. The thinking of intelligence is to have thoughts. These are as its content and object. Encyclopedia section 466. But cognition by thought is still in the first instance formal. The universality and its being is the plain subjectivity of intelligence. The thoughts, therefore, are not yet fully and freely determinate, and the representations which have been inwardized to thoughts are so far still the given content. Encyclopedia section 467. As dealing with this given account, thought is meta infrasection alpha 1, understanding with its formal identity, working up the representation that have been memorized into species, genera, laws, forces, and similar things. In short, into categories, thus indicating that the raw material does not get the truth of its being save in these thought forms. As intrinsically infinite negativity, thought is, meta infra section beta 1, essentially an act of partition, judgment, which, however, does not break up the concept again into the old antithesis of universality in being, but distinguishes on the lines supplied by the interconnections peculiar to the concept. Thirdly, meta infrasection gamma 1, thought supersedes the formal distinction and institutes at the same time an identity of the differences, thus being nominal reason or inferential understanding. Intelligence as the act of thought cognizes, and meta intersection alpha 2, understanding out of its generalities, the categories, explains the individual, and is then said to comprehend or understand itself. Meta intersection beta 2. In the judgment, it explains the individual to be an universal, species, genus. In these forms, the content appears as given. Meta intersection gamma 2. But in inference, syllogism, it characterizes a content from itself by superseding that form difference with the perception of the necessity. The last immediacy still attaching to formal thought has vanished. In logic, there was thought, but in its implicitness, and as reason develops itself in this distinction lacking medium, so in consciousness, thought occurs as a stage. See the note for section 437. Here, reason is as the truth of the antithetical distinction, as it had taken shape within the mind's own limits. Thought thus recurs again and again in these different parts of philosophy, because these parts are different only through the medium they are in and the antithesis they imply, while thought is this one and the same center to which, as to their truth, the antithesis returns. Encyclopedia section 468. Intelligence, which as theoretical appropriates an immediate mode of being, is, now that it has completed taking possession in its own property, the last negation of immediacy has implicitly required that the intelligence shall itself determine its content. Thus, thought, as free notion, is now also free in point of content. But when intelligence is aware that it is determinative of the content, which is its mode no less than it is a mode of being, it is will. Section 1, Subjective Mind. Subsection C, Psychology, Mind, der Geist. Super subsection B, Mind, Practical, der praktische Geist. Encyclopedia section 469. As will, the mind is aware that it is the author of its own conclusions, the origin of its self fulfillment. Thus fulfilled, this independency or individuality form the side of existence or of reality for the idea of mind. As will, the mind steps into actuality, whereas as cognition, it is on the soil of notational. As will, the mind steps into actuality, whereas as cognition, it is on the soil of notational. As will, the mind steps into actuality, whereas as cognition, it is on the soil of notional generality. Supplying its own content, the will is self possessed and in the widest sense free. This is its characteristic trait. Its finitude lies in the formalism that the spontaneity of its self fulfillment means no more than a general and abstract ownness, not yet identified with mature reason. It is the function of the essential will to bring liberty to exist in the formal will, and it is therefore the aim of that formal will to fill itself with its essential nature, in essence, to make liberty its pervading, in essence, to make liberty its pervading character, content, and aim, as well as its sphere of existence. The essential freedom of will is, and must always be, a thought. Hence, the way by which will can make itself objective mind is to rise to be a thinking will, to give itself the content which it can only have as it thinks itself. True liberty, in the shape of moral life, consists in the will finding its purpose in a universal content, not in subjective or selfish interests. But such a content is only possible in thought, and through thought it is nothing short of absurd to seek to banish thought from the moral, religious, and law abiding life. Encyclopedia section 470. Practical mind, considered at first as formal or immediate will, contains a double ought. And for section 1, in the contrast which the new mode of being projected outward by the will offers to the immediate positivity of its old existence and condition, an antagonism which in consciousness grows to correlation with external objects. And for section 2, that first self-determination, being itself immediate, is not at once elevated into a thinking universality. The latter, therefore, virtually constitutes an obligation on the former in point of form, as it may also constitute it in point of matter, a distinction which only exists for the observer. Section 1, Subjective Mind, subsection C, Psychology, Mind, der Geist. Supersection Supersection B, Mind, Practical, der praktische Geist. Metasection Alpha, Practical Sense or Feeling, der praktische Gefühl. Encyclopedia section 471. The autonomy of the practical mind at first is immediate and therefore formal. In essence, it finds itself as an individuality determined in its inward nature. It is thus practical feeling, or instinct of action. In this phase, as it is at bottom a subjectivity simply identical with reason, it has no doubt a rational content, but a content which as it stands is individual, and for that reason also natural, contingent, and subjective. A content which may be determined quite as much by mere personalities of want and opinion and similar things, and by the subjectivity which selfishly, a content which may be determined quite as much by mere personalities of want and opinion and such things, and by the subjectivity which selfishly sets itself against the universal, as it may be virtually in conformity with reason. An appeal is something made to the sense, feeling, of right and morality, as well as of religion, which man is alleged to possess, to his benevolent dispositions, and even to his heart generally, in essence, to the subject so far as the various practical feelings are in it all combined. So far as this appeal applies, in for section 1, that these ideas are immanent in his own self, and, in for section 2, that when feeling is opposed to logical understanding, it, and not the partial abstractions of the latter, may be the totality. The appeal has a legitimate meaning, but on the other hand, feeling too may be one sided, unessential, and bad. The rational, which exists in the shape of rationality, when it is apprehended by thought, is the same content as the good practical feeling has, but presented in its universality and necessity, in its objectivity and truth. Thus, it is on the one hand silly to suppose that in the passage from feeling to law and duty there is any loss of import and excellence. It is this passage which lets feeling first reach its truth. It is equally silly to consider intellect as superfluous, or even harmful to feeling. Heart and will, the truth and heart. It is equally silly to consider intellect as superfluous, or even harmful to feeling, heart, and will. The truth and, what is the same thing, the actual rationality of the heart and will can only be at home in the universality of intellect, and not in the singleness of feeling as feeling. It feels if feelings are of the right sort, it is because of their quality or content, which is right only so far as it is intrinsically universal or has its source in the thinking mind. The difficulty for the logical intellect consists in throwing off the separation it has arbitrarily imposed between the several faculties of feeling and thinking mind, and coming to see that in the human being there is only one reason, in feeling, volition, and thought. Another difficulty connected with this is found in the fact that the ideas, which are the special property of the thinking mind, in light of God, law, and morality, can also be felt, but feeling is only the form of the immediate and peculiar individuality of the subject in which these facts, like any other objective facts, which consciousness also sets over against itself, may be placed. On the other hand, it is suspicious, or even worse, to cling to feeling and heart in place of the intelligent rationality of law, right, and duty, because all that the former holds more than the latter is only the particular subjectivity with its vanity and caprice. For the same reason, it is out of place in a scientific treatment of the feelings to deal with anything beyond their form, and to discuss their content, for the latter, when thought is precisely what constitutes, in their universality and necessity, the rights and duties which are the true works of mental autonomy. So long as we study practical feelings and dispositions specifically, so long as we study practical feelings and dispositions specially, we have only to deal with the selfish, bad, and evil. It is these alone which belong to the individuality which retains its opposition to the universal. Their content is the reverse of rights and duties. And precisely in that way do they, but only in antithesis to the latter, retain a speciality or a speciality of their own. Encyclopedia section 472. The ought of practical feeling is the claim of its essential autonomy to control some existing mode of fact, which is assumed to be worth nothing save as adapted to that claim, but as both, in their immediacy, lack objective determination. This relation of the requirement to existent fact is the utterly subjective and superficial feeling of pleasant or unpleasant, delight, joy, grief, and similar, shame, repentance, contentment, and similar, are partly only modifications of the formal, practical feeling in general, but are partly different in the features that give the special tone and character mode to their ought. The celebrated question as to the origin of evil in the world, so far at least as evil is understood to mean what is disagreeable and painful merely, arises on the stage of the formal, practical feeling. Evil is nothing but the incompatibility between what is and what ought to be. Ought is an ambiguous term, indeed, infinitely so, considering that casual aims may also come under the form of ought. But where the objects sought are thus casual, evil only executes what is rightfully due to the vanity and nullity of their planning, for they themselves were radically evil. The finitude of life and mind is seen in their judgment. The contrary which is separated from them, they also have as a negative in them, and thus they are the contradiction called evil. In the dead there is neither evil nor pain, for in inorganic nature the intelligible unity concept does not confront its existence and does not in the difference at the same time remain its permanent subject, whereas in life, and still more in mind, we have this eminent distinction present, hence arises the ought, and this negativity, subjectivity, ego, freedom, are the principles of evil and pain. Jacob Boehme viewed egoity, selfhood, as pain and torment, as the fountain of nature and of spirit. Section 1, Subjective Mind. Subsection C, Psychology, Mind, der Geist. Suprasubsection B, Mind, Practical, der praktische Geist. Metasection Beta, the impulses and choice, der Darüber und der Willkür. Encyclopedia section 473, the practical ought is a real judgment. Will, which is essentially self-determination, finds in the conformity as immediate and merely found to hand of the existing mode to its requirements a negation, and something inappropriate to it. If the will is to satisfy itself, if the implicit unity of the universality and the special mode is to be realized, the conformity of its inner requirements and of the existent thing ought to be its act and institution. The will, as regards the form of its content, is at first still a natural will, directly identical with its specific mode, natural impulse and inclination. Should, however, the totality of the practical spirit throw itself into a single one of the many restricted forms of impulse, each being always in conflict to another, it is passion. Encyclopedia section 474. Inclinations and passions embody the same constituent features as the practical feeling. Thus, while on one hand they are based on the rational nature of the mind, they, on the other, as part and parcel of the still subjective and single will, are infected with contingency. and appear as particular to stand to the individual and to each other in an external relation and with a necessity which creates bondage. The special note in passion is its restriction to one special mode of volition, in which the whole subjectivity of the individual is merged. Be the value of that mode what it may, in consequence of this formalism, passion is neither good nor bad. The title only states that a subject has thrown his whole soul, his interest of intellect, talent, character, enjoyment, on one aim and object. Nothing great has been, and nothing great can be accomplished without passion. It is only a dead, too often, indeed, a hypocritical moralizing which invites against the form of passion as such. But with regard to the inclinations, the question is directly raised: which are good and bad? Up to what degree the good continue good? And, as there are many, each with its private range, in what way have they, being all in one subject and hardly all, in what way have they, being all in one subject and hardly all, as experience shows, admitting of gratification, to suffer at least reciprocal restriction? And first of all, as regards the numbers of these impulses and propensities, the case is such that And first of all, as regards the numbers of these impulses and propensities, the case is such the same as with the psychical powers, whose aggregate is to form the mind theoretical, an aggregate which is now increased by the host of impulses. The nominal rationality of impulse and propensity lies merely in their general impulse, not to be subjective merely, but to get realized, overcoming the subjectivity by the subject's own agency. Their general rationality cannot reveal its secret to a method of outer reflection which presupposes a number of independent innate tendencies and immediate instincts, and therefore is wanting in a single principle and final purpose for them. But the immanent reflection of mind itself carries it beyond their particularity and their natural immediacy, and gives their contents a rationality and objectivity in which they exist as necessary ties of social relation. As rights and duties, it is thus objectification which evinces their real value, their mutual connections, and their truth. And thus it was a true perception when Plato, especially including as he did the mind's whole nature under its right, showed that the full reality of justice could be exhibited only in the objective phase of justice, in light, in the construction of the state as the ethical life. And thus it was a true perception when Plato, especially including as he did the mind's whole nature under its right, showed that the full reality of justice could be exhibited only in the object, could be exhibited only in the objective phase of justice, by way of or in the construction of the state as the ethical life. The answer to the question, therefore, what are the good and rational propensities, and how they are to be coordinated with each other, resolves itself into an exposition of the laws and forms of common life produced by the mind when developing itself as objective mind, a development in which the content of autonomous action loses its contingency and optionality. The discussion of the true intrinsic worth of the impulses, inclinations, and passions is thus essentially the theory of legal, moral, and social duties. Encyclopedia section 475. The subject is the act of satisfying impulses, an act of at least formal rationality, as it translates them from the subjectivity of content, which so far is purpose, into objectivity, where the subject is made to close with itself. If the content of the impulse is distinguished as the thing or business from this act of carrying it out, and we regard the thing which has been brought to pass as containing the elements of subjective individuality and its action, this is what is called the interest. Nothing, therefore, is brought about without interest. An action is an aim of the subject, and it is his agency too which executes this aim, unless the subject were in this way in the most disinterested action. In essence, unless he had an interest in it, there would be no action at all. The impulses and inclinations are sometimes deprecated. The impulses and inclinations are sometimes depreciated by being contrasted with the baseless chimera of a happiness, the free gift of nature, where wants are supposed to find their satisfaction without the agent doing anything to produce a conformity between immediate existence and his own inner requirements. They are sometimes contrasted, on the whole, to their disadvantage with the morality of duty for duty's sake. But impulse and passion are the very lifeblood of all action. They are needed if the agent is really to be in his aim and the execution thereof. The morality concerns the content of the aim, which as such is the universal, an inactive thing that finds its actualizing in the agent, and finds it only when the aim is immanent in the agent, in his interest, and should it claim to engross his whole efficient subjectivity, his passion. Encyclopedia section 476. The will, as thinking and implicitly free, distinguishes itself from the particularity of the impulses and places itself as simple subjectivity of thought above their diversified content. It is thus reflecting will. Encyclopedia section 477. Such a particularity of impulse has thus ceased to be a mere datum. The reflective will now sees it as its own, because it closes with it and thus gives itself specific individuality and actuality. It is now on the standpoint of choosing between inclinations and is option or choice. Encyclopedia section 478. Will as choice claims to be free, reflected into itself as the negativity of its mere immediate autonomy. However, as the content in which its formal universality concludes itself to the actuality is nothing but the content of the impulses and appetites, it is actually only as a subjective and contingent will. It realizes itself in a particularity, which it regards at the time, which it regards at the same time as a nullity, and finds a satisfaction in what it has at the same time emerged from. It realizes itself in a particularity, which it regards at the same time as a nullity, and finds a satisfaction in what it has at the same time emerged from, and thus contradictory. It is the process of distracting and suspending one desire or enjoyment by another, and one satisfaction, which is just as much no satisfaction, by another without end. For the truth of the particular satisfactions is the universal, which under the name of happiness the thinking will makes its aim. Section 1, Subjective Mind. Subsection C, Psychology, Mind, der Geist. Supersubsection B, Mind Practical, der praktische Geist. Metasection Gamma, Happiness, die Unzähligkeit. Encyclopedia section 479. In this idea, which reflection and comparison hath educed, of a universal satisfaction, the impulses, so far as their particularity goes, are reduced to a mere negative, and it is held that in part they are to be sacrificed to each other for the behoof that aim, partly sacrificed to that aim directly, either altogether or in part. Their mutual limitation, on one hand, proceeds from a mixture of qualitative and quantitative considerations. On the other hand, as happiness has its sole affirmative content in the springs of action, it is on them that the decision turns, and it is the subjective feeling and good pleasure which must have the casting vote as to where happiness is to be placed. Encyclopedia section 480. Happiness is the mere abstract and merely imagined universality of things desired, a universality which only ought to be, but the particularity of the satisfaction, which just as much is as it is abolished, and the abstract singleness, the option which gives or does not give itself as it pleases, and aim and happiness find their truth in the intrinsic universality of the will. In essence, its very autonomy or freedom. In this way, choice is will only as pure subjectivity, which is pure and concrete at once, by having for its contents and aim only the infinite mode of being, freedom itself. In this truth of its autonomy, where concept and object are one, the will is an actually free will. Subject Section 1, Subjective Mind, Final Concept, Free Mind, Der freie Geist. Encyclopedia section 481. Actual free will is the unity of theoretical and practical mind, a free will which realizes its own freedom of will now that the formalism, fortuitousness, and contractedness of the practical content up to this point have been superseded. By superseding the adjustment of means therein contained, the will is immediate individuality self instituted, an individuality, however, also purified of all that interferes with its universalism, in essence, with freedom itself. This universalism, the will, has as its objective and aim only so far as it thinks itself, knows this its concept, and is will as free intelligence. Encyclopedia section 42. The mind which knows itself as free and wills itself as this its object, in essence, which has its true being for characteristic and aim, is in the first instance the rational will in general or implicit idea, and because implicit only the notion of absolute mind. As abstract idea again, it is existent only in the immediate will. It is the existential side of reason, the single will as aware of this, its universality constituting its contents and aim, and of which it is only the formal activity. If the will, therefore, in which the idea thus appears is only finite, that will is also the act of developing the idea, and of investing its self unfolding content with an existence which, as realizing the idea, is actuality. It is thus objective mind. No idea is so generally recognized as indefinite, ambiguous, and open to the greatest misconceptions, to which therefore it actually falls a victim, as the idea of liberty. None is common currency with so little appreciation of its meaning. Remembering that free mind is actual mind, we can see how misconceptions about it are of tremendous consequence in practice. When individuals and nations have once got in their heads the abstract concept of full blown liberty, there is nothing like it in its uncontrollable strength, just because it is the very essence of mind, and that as its very actuality. Whole continents, Africa and the East, have never had this idea and are without it still. The Greeks and Romans, Plato and Aristotle, even the Stoics did not have it. On the contrary, they saw that it is only by birth, as, ergo, therefore, an Athenian or Spartan citizen, or by strength of character, education, or philosophy. The sage is free even as a slave and in chains, that the human being is actually free. It was through Christianity that this idea came into the world. According to Christianity, the individual as such has an infinite value as the object and aim of divine love, destined as mind to live in absolute relationship with God Himself and have God's mind dwelling in him. In essence, man is implicitly destined to supreme freedom. If in religion, as such, man is aware of this relationship to the absolute mind as his true being, he has also, even when he steps into the sphere of secular existence, the divine mind present with him as the substance of the state of the family and similar. These institutions are due to the guidance of that spirit and are constituted after its measure, whilst by their existence the moral temper comes to be indwelling in the individual, so that in the sphere of particular existence, of present sensation and volition, he is actually free. If to be aware of the idea, to be aware, in essence, that men are aware of freedom as their essence, aim, and object, is matter of speculation, still, this very idea itself is the actuality of men, not something which they have as men, but which they are. Christianity and its adherents has realized an ever present sense that they are not and cannot be slaves. If they are made slaves, if the decision as regards their property rests with an arbitrary will, not with laws or courts of justice, they would find the very substance of their life outraged. This will to liberty is no longer an impulse which demands its satisfaction, but the permanent character, the spiritual consciousness grown into a non impulsive nature. But this freedom, which the content and aim of freedom has, is itself only a notion, a principle of the mind and heart, intended to develop into an objective phase, into legal, moral, religious, and not less into scientific actuality. End of Hegel's Philosophy of Mind, Section 1, Subjective Mind.